Good morning and welcome to today's administrative meeting of the Maryland Public Service Commission. We have a good crowd today. Apologies for starting a few minutes behind schedule. A few opening announcements before we begin the administrative meeting. At first, I wanted to recognize one of our longtime employees here, Ernestine Carter. Is Ernestine here? There she is behind the chair. Ernestine's been with the Commission since 2006, working in our Office of External Relations. Everybody knows her affectionately here as just Miss Ernestine, and she is going to be missed for sure. I had an opportunity to visit with her in her office last week. She's worked her entire life, spent a good period of time at the old Chesapeake and Potomac Telephone Company before coming to the PSC. I received some statistics from OER on the number of cases that she's worked on over the years, including resolving nearly 7,000 written complaints, and she closed just over 2,000 fast-track inquiries during her time here. Ernestine, I know that you're going to be very active post-PSC in your retirement. You have some big plans ahead of you, but please know that all of your colleagues in OER and the PSC will be missing you truly. Thank you for your service.
Thank you.
I also wanted to let the public know I received a letter via overnight delivery last night, so it must be important if it was sent FedEx. It was from the U.S. Department of Transportation. As some of you may know, they monitor our state pipeline programs. And in exchange, depending on how we do, the state receives some supplemental federal grants from the U.S. government. These safety programs are monitored by an independent agency within the DOT, and that's PHMSA, the Pipeline and Hazardous Materials Safety Administration. This letter that I received provided terrific news, and that is that we scored a perfect score on two of the programs, both the gas pipeline safety program and the hazardous liquids program. They sliced and diced this information in a number of ways, and we scored 109 out of a total of 109 possible points on the gas program, and a perfect score of 111 out of 111 on the liquids program. They also took pains to recognize John Clemenson, who is our Assistant Chief Engineer. Is John here today? No, he's not, but his boss, John Berkowski, is here. I just want to recognize all the hard work, the fact that we got exemplary comments from the federal government for our engineering department. So thank you to the engineering department. With that, we'll begin today's meeting with approval of the meeting minutes from last week, August the 15th. Do I have a motion to accept those minutes?
Yes, Mr. Chairman. I move that we accept the minutes from the August 15th administrative meeting.
Is there a second?
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
The minutes are approved. Madam Secretary, can we move to the consent agenda?
Yes, Mr. Chairman. There are two items on the consent agenda. The first item is Hagerstown Light Department, filed on July 19, 2018, a request for approval of its designated weather station in compliance with COMAR 2031-0303 and 2031-0304. The second item is Baltimore Gas and Electric Company, filed on July 30, 2018, its list of designated weather stations in compliance with COMAR Section 2031-0305.
Thank you. Is there a motion?
Yes, Mr. Chairman, I move that for items 1 and 2, that we approve the weather station designations for the purpose of determining when there is an extreme weather period that requires restrictions on electricity service terminations under COMAR 20.31.03.03 and 20.31.03.04.
Thank you. Is there a second? Second. All in favor?
Aye.
The motion is approved. Madam Secretary, the administrative agenda, please.
The third item on the administrative agenda is Q-Link Wireless LLC, filed on July 31, 2018, a petition to expand its eligible telecommunications carrier service area.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman, Commissioners. Lloyd Spivak for the Commission staff. This is a filing by Q-Link Wireless LLC seeking to expand its eligible telecommunications carrier service area for the purpose of providing a telephone lifeline service. Section 254 of the Telecommunications Act of 1996 provides for universal service, which seeks to ensure access to basic telecommunications services at affordable prices for all Americans. One aspect of universal service is the availability of subsidies from the Federal Universal Service Fund. Carriers wishing to obtain subsidies from the Universal Service Fund may do so under the Low Income Program or the High Cost Program. The company is only seeking subsidies under the Low Income Program. Pursuant to the provisions of 47 U.S. Code Section 214E2, state commissions have primary responsibility for the designation of eligible telecommunications carriers. In Maryland, universal service goals are pursued through telephone lifeline service as required by the Public Utilities Article Section 8-201. Q-Link is a wireless carrier that has been certified as an eligible telecommunications carrier in Maryland since December 21st, 2011. The company currently operates in all Sprint service areas within Maryland and is seeking to expand its service as an eligible telecommunications carrier to all areas of the state where T-Mobile has underlying wireless network coverage. Given that Q-Link was granted eligible telecommunications carrier designation back in 2011 and has affirmed that the information provided in its original petition, its first expansion petition, and in its FCC compliance plan remains accurate, staff is satisfied that Q-Link may be designated as an eligible telecommunications carrier in the service areas requested by the companies. Staff recommends that the Commission grant the company expansion of its eligible telecommunications carrier service area to include T-Mobile as an additional underlying carrier as specified in the petition for the limited purpose of offering lifeline service to qualified households in Maryland. Staff further recommends that the Commission grant the petition with an effective date of today, provided no adverse comments are filed within 30 days of this date.
Thank you, Mr. Spivak. I can tell you that as somebody who's becoming more familiar with the telecom industry, having very little background, I appreciate the thoroughness of the buck sheet and your presentation, so this was helpful for me. With that, I do not have any questions. Questions from the commissioners? Seeing none, is there a motion?
Yes, Mr. Chairman, I move we grant the company an expansion of its eligible telecommunication carrier service area for the service territory specified in its petition for the limited purpose of offering lifeline service to qualified households in Maryland effective August 22nd, 2018, provided no adverse comments are filed within 30 days of the effective date.
Is there a second?
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
The motion is approved.
Thank you, Commissioners.
Item number 4 is Ebulance LLC, DBA Ebulance Group, filed on March 5, 2018, an application for license to supply electricity or electric generation services in the state of Maryland.
Good morning, Chairman and Commissioners. Peter Wolson for staff. Pursuant to Public Utilities Article 7507, Ebulance LLC has filed an application for a license to operate in Maryland as a broker of electricity in all Maryland service territories, serving all customer classes. Staff has reviewed the application and has determined that the company meets all requirements to grant authorization as an electricity broker as requested. Staff's investigation has uncovered no complaint history in Texas, where the company currently does business. The company has provided the bond required by Comar 20.51. Staff has reviewed the company's training and marketing materials and website and finds them satisfactory. For these reasons, staff recommends the Commission grant the company a license to operate as an electricity broker in Maryland for all customer classes as requested, and direct the company to notify the Commission within 30 days of any changes to the information in its application.
Thank you, Mr. Wolson. Counsel for Ebulance.
Yes, sir.
Do you have any comments to add?
No, we're eager to do business in the state. We're very knowledgeable. We transacted here before in a prior engagement with a company called PowerMark. We're very experienced with all the utilities. We're very experienced with the tariffs. Great at what we do, and we have employees waiting, and we're waiting to transact given the state accepts our application.
Thank you. I'm sorry, your name?
Ryan Kessler.
Thank you.
Mr. Kessler, what's your position with
I'm the CEO.
your CEO?
We transact in other states as well. We were granted our broker's license in the state of Illinois. We also are able to transact in New York and Ohio, and obviously Texas, where we're based out of, and we're looking to grow.
Thank you. Any questions for staff or Mr. Kessler?
Yes, Mr. Chairman, just a quick question for Mr. Kessler. You just mentioned a moment ago that you had transacted business in Maryland earlier.
That was with the prior company before starting Ebulance. We have not been able to transact at all. We're waiting the opportunity to transact given that we're accepted.
Okay, so there hasn't been any transactions with Ebulance?
No, sir.
Okay. All right.
I was just simply stating that because I'm knowledgeable and my expertise in the market is very well.
Okay.
And Mr.
Understood.
Kessler, you're based in Texas?
Yes, sir.
I have no further questions. Is there a motion?
Mr. Chairman, I move the commission grant the company a license to operate as an electricity supplier in Maryland, limited to broker services for all customer classes and service territories applied for and recommended by staff, and further direct the company to file notice with the commission within 30 days of any changes to the information in the application.
Thank you, Commissioner O'Donnell. Is there a second?
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
The motion for Ebulance is approved.
Thank you.
The next two items will be taken together, item 5 and 6. 5 is the Brio Energy Corporation filed on May 3, 2018, an application for a license to supply electricity or electric generation services in Maryland. And item 6 is the Brio Energy Corporation filed on May 3, 2018, an application for a license to supply natural gas or natural gas supply services in Maryland.
And if counsel for Brio is here, they may approach.
Peter Wilson again for staff, and similar to the last item, pursuant to Public Utilities Articles 7507 and 7603, Brio Energy has filed applications for licenses to operate in Maryland as a broker of electricity and natural gas in all Maryland service territories, serving all customer classes. Staff has reviewed the applications and has determined that the company meets all requirements to grant authorization as an electricity and gas broker as requested. The company has no complaint history in Ohio where it does business and has provided the bond required by Comar 20.51 and 20.54. Staff has reviewed the company's website and finds it satisfactory. To date, the company has not yet developed Maryland-specific marketing and training materials. For these reasons, staff recommends the Commission grant the company licenses to operate as an electricity and natural gas broker for all customer classes in all Maryland service territories as requested, and direct the company to provide Commission staff and the Office of People's Counsel marketing and training materials specific to its Maryland operations 30 days prior to utilization in Maryland, and direct the company to notify the Commission within 30 days of any changes to the information in its application.
Thank you, Mr. Wilson. Is there a motion?
Yes, Mr. Chairman. For item number 5 and 6, I move we grant the company a license to operate as an electricity supplier and as a natural gas supplier in Maryland, limited to broker and aggregator services for all customer classes and service territories applied for and recommended by staff, and direct the company to provide marketing and training materials specific to its Maryland operations to the Commission staff and Office of the People's Counsel 30 days prior to utilization of the materials in Maryland, and direct the company to file notice with the Commission within 30 days of any changes to the information in the application.
Thank you. Is there a second on both motions?
Seconded on both motions.
All those in favor?
Aye.
Both motions are approved.
Item number 7 is Todd Solar LLC, filed on June 29, 2018, requests modifications to Certificate of Public Convenience and Necessity, case number 9412.
Good morning again, Mr. Chairman, Commissioners. Lloyd Spivak for the Commission staff. On June 29, 2018, Todd Solar filed a written request to the Commission for modifications to its existing Certificate of Public Convenience and Necessity, or CPCN, in connection with a project located in Dorchester County, Maryland. In the company's original CPCN filing, Todd requested permission to construct a 20-megawatt solar generating facility which would interconnect to the PJM system through DPL's 69 kilovolt and 25 kilovolt system facilities located at the Todd Substation on Skeet Club Road in Dorchester County, approximately 1 mile northwest of the site. The design called for 2 new 25 kilovolt distribution feeders running from the site's DPL Todd Substation on a single pole line for a distance of approximately 1.4 miles. In its current filing, Todd Solar requests authorization from the Commission to modify its original engineering design from an overhead configuration to an underground configuration because neither DPL nor Todd Solar were able to secure the required private rights of way for an overhead line. The associated costs for undergrounding the newly installed 25 kilovolt feeders will be borne by Todd Solar. Todd Solar also requests that the Commission extend the construction and operational deadlines set by the Power Plant Research Program in its licensing conditions. The company has requested this modification so that the time restrictions in its CPCN are aligned with the deadlines contained in the company's recently approved extension for the project, approved by the special exception acquired from the Dorchester County Board of Appeals. As of its most recent filing, Todd Solar has amended its requested extension of the project's construction start and operational deadlines under PPRP Condition 4 to January 21st, 2021 and January 21st, 2022, respectively. The Power Plant Research Program has asked that additional final dates be set beyond which no further extensions would be granted. Staff has reviewed the filing and is assured that the operational aspects of the proposed generating facility are unchanged. PPRP has stated that it concurs with the request. Staff recommends that the Commission approve the requested modification to Todd Solar's CPCN.
Thank you, Mr. Spivak. And Mr. Wilson, a very helpful buck sheet again. Mr. Bugelmans, do you have anything to add?
Good morning, Mr. Chairman, Commissioners. David Bugelmans on behalf of Todd Solar LLC. As Mr. Spivak indicated, staff, PPRP, and Todd Solar are generally in agreement. As the Commission knows, PPRP submitted a letter with a set of, I call them steps, to basically update the conditions to the CPCN based off of PPRP's most recent conditions from more recent projects. Todd Solar does have one concern about those steps, and it concerns Step 5, which Mr. Spivak mentioned in passing. That condition imposes a final cutoff, after which no further extensions could be issued. The dates in there are July 28th, 2022, as far as start of construction, and July 28th, 2023 for the start of operations. So that language would essentially foreclose the Commission from offering extensions past that date. It's our position that the Commission could consider any further requests on a case-by-case basis, and there's no need to unnecessarily limit the Commission's discretion on further requests. There's clearly instances where the Commission would not find good cause to grant an extension, and at that point it could say enough is enough, that we're not going to issue any further extensions. But there's other cases where we think it would be appropriate for the Commission to offer extensions past that date, and we just don't believe it's appropriate to foreclose that action at this time. I also think it's debatable whether the Commission could bind future commissions from taking action on that request. But other than that, one issue, all the parties are in agreement. I'm here to answer the Commission's questions on this one issue as well as the wider amendment request. Thank you very much.
Wondering if Mr. Tolson would mind answering a question on this matter for PPRP.
Morning, Mr. Chairman. Commissioner Steve Tolson. I'm an Assistant Attorney General and I'm counsel for PPRP, and with me this morning is Mr. Bob Sadinsky, who's the project manager for Todd Solar. So I'll see if I can answer Commissioner O'Donnell's question. If not, I may ask Mr. Sadinsky to take care of it.
So the first question I have is, you've modified the request for Condition 5 to preclude any further extensions beyond a date certain. Can we legally bind the discretion of future commissions in that regard?
Well, I agree with Mr. Bugelmans on that. It's uncertain. I don't know that that's a matter that's been settled or even raised. I believe that the concern that PPRP has is that a CPCN is sort of a perishable item. If something goes beyond 6 years of the original application, the original public hearings, the original consultations with the county, there's a good chance that that project's going to be significantly different than the one that was approved. And we now have a requirement, as you know, with recent additions to the code to address the project's consistency with the county's site plan, with their zoning. These things are all subject to change over the course of the years, and I believe that PPRP's concern was not with trying to limit the discretion of the commission or prevent the applicant from seeking changes, but to say that if that is the case, that perhaps it's time to file a new application and to allow the public an opportunity then to weigh in on this revised application. Because if something isn't built in those 6 years, there's probably a good reason for it.
Perhaps not.
Not.
Perhaps there's good cause shown for a further extension. And so I'm having a hard time binding. I mean, all of the things that you brought up, why we shouldn't go beyond 6 years, seems to me that they would be the matter of discussion at the time that an application for extension was made. And then you can make your case on the merits. But to preclude and take away that discretion ahead of time doesn't seem to make sense. Let me ask you this, and maybe it's Mr. Sadinsky. On July 30th, you submitted a letter without that extension preclusion?
That's correct.
And then in August, the PPRP changed their mind. Why the change of heart?
Let me step aside and let Mr. Sadinsky address that.
Okay.
Good morning. Yep, Bob Sinsky, Maryland Department of Natural Resources Power Plant Research Program. I believe we had internal discussions, and it just gives us a hard date to look at, in short.
Yeah, but it takes away our discretion. So PPRP, Department of Natural Resources, is taking away this commission's discretion in the future in this regard, which we will probably be reluctant to give up lightly.
Sir, I did not know that condition would actually do that.
Okay.
Can I just add a question for Mr. Tolson? I was interested in your answer, and that is, after 6 years, it may be important for the public to have another opportunity to get involved. When you look at these modifications, you consider these modifications, is the public notified in those cases? And I mean, is there an opportunity for public input when these modifications are being considered by PPRP?
Well, I believe in our letter of July, we did mention that there would be an opportunity for public comment, but it's a different process than the statutory process that goes with an original CPCN application. And as you know, only one public hearing is normally required, but by practice lately, we've been doing 2 public hearings, one early on in the application process and then one fairly close to the time that we have the final evidentiary hearing. It allows the public, I think, ample opportunity to express any concerns that they have and to also allow the local representatives to participate in that process. So I think PPRP's concern was in preserving the CPCN process and not converting it into an admin hearing process where the applicant can come in 6 years later and request, we don't know what type of modifications. They could be minor, they could be major, and then that is done outside of the CPCN process. So I believe that was PPRP's concern when they looked at this and said, are we going to have a limitless process here? Or is there an expiration? As you know, air permits expire after 18 years, or 18 months. If you don't start construction, then that air permit expires and you're finished. And I believe PPRP's position is that a similar condition is prudent. And we're not saying that they can't build the project, we're not saying whatever, we're just saying you have to use the CPCN process to do so and not the administrative meeting process.
Okay, well, fair enough. I agree with Commissioner O'Donnell that I would hesitate to preclude a future action by this commission. And it's my understanding, though, that the public is given opportunity to weigh in on any kind of modification. So I do have some comfort there that we're not, again, at some point in the process, precluding input. So anyway, thank you for that answer.
Thank you.
Can I ask staff a question?
Please do, Commissioner.
Thank you. This new language says, under no circumstances. Does staff support that with an extension beyond those revised dates? Under no circumstances. I can imagine a whole lot of circumstances that we would want to exercise some discretionary, make sense, common sense and yet this would say under no circumstances. Staff's recommendation is to approve the requested modification. Very simple. Which modification? The July recommendation from PPRP or the August recommendation from PPRP?
I think we would prefer the July recommendation. I did want to add, actually, with respect to Mr. Tolson's last comment on the CPC, using the CPCN process versus using the administrative meeting process. There's always been a discussion back and forth whenever a modification application comes in as to which process is appropriate to use for that particular modification. Generally when it is a less substantive modification or a minor modification that will not have a serious effect, then it does go through the administrative process. But if it is any kind of major modification to the project or the configuration of the project, then we would generally ask for it to be subject to a full CPCN hearing and docketed as a case. That can and does happen with some frequency around here. So I'm not that concerned about losing the CPCN process. We just have to be fairly rigorous in trying to draw a line between when we would.
I think this commission has demonstrated since I've been here a high regard for the CPCN process and kind of jealously as well guards its integrity and inviolability. And when people try to kind of get around the CPCN process with some shortcuts, we are very quick to point that out and to not be so quick to approve those types of maneuvers. So I'm very respectful of the CPCN process. I don't think we are bypassing it even today if we approve the July language, and I think the commission will probably be in a position, I can't speak for everybody, but I can speak for myself, that I would certainly defend the CPCN process and its inviolability pretty strongly. So,
Any other commissioner comments or proposals?
Mr. Chairman, I just think that if we're at a point to act on this, that we need to specify and make clear that we're approving the modification to condition 5 as submitted by PPRP in its July 7th, whatever the July letter is, that did not put an exclusion going, an extension going forward dates in. July 10th. 30.
July 30.
Okay.
July 30?
I think it's worth making one clarification, Commissioner O'Donnell. I'm sorry to interrupt. Yesterday, we filed on behalf of Todd Solar a letter updating the dates. So PPRP's August 17th letter includes October 26, make sure I get the dates right, October 26, 2020 as the date, as the deadline for the commencement of construction, and October 26, 2021 as the deadline for operations. In our letter yesterday, we updated those dates, so it would be January 21st, 2021 for the commencement of construction and January 21st, 2022 for the commencement of operations. And that was based off of a misreading on our part of the extension granted by the county. So it's about a little under 3 months difference.
Could you say those two dates again, please?
Sure. It's January 21st, 2021 for the construction deadline and January 21st, 2022 for the operational deadline.
I'm sorry, who did you file that letter with yesterday?
I filed it with the commission, Your Honor. It was filed yesterday, and it's possible that the paper copies haven't made it to the commission yet, but it's online, so I'm sorry for the late filing.
So does PPRP agree with those dates?
Yes, Your Honor.
Okay, thank you.
We saw it and we do agree.
Okay.
It was based on the county's extension and revision of the date.
So I would clarify my recommendation, Mr. Chairman, once we get to a motion, that we just be clear that we use these new dates and we exclude the preclusion of future extension language.
Yes, Commissioner O'Donnell. I don't have the paper copy of Mr. Bugelman's filing yesterday, but it's in my inbox. Is somebody prepared to make a motion noting Commissioner O'Donnell's statement?
Got some of it. I can.
Commissioner Linton, if you could start it, and we'll amend.
Started. I would move for item number 7 that we approve the requested modification as stated in the July 30 letter, that the construction deadline be January 21st, 2021, and that the date for operation be January 21st, 2022.
Is there a second?
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
The motion is approved.
Thank you, Commissioner.
The next items on the agenda can be taken together. Those are items 8 and 9. 8 is Potomac Electric Power Company, filed on June 15, 2018. Its updated rider SOS standard offer service rates, case numbers 9056 and 9064. And number 9 is Delmarva Power and Light Company, filed on June 15, 2018. Its updated rider SOS standard offer service rates, cases number 9056 and 9064.
Good morning, Chairman, Commissioners. Michael Dean on behalf of staff. Items 8 and 9 are tariff filings by the Potomac Electric Power Company and Delmarva Power and Light Company updating the standard offer service rates for Type 2 commercial customers. Under Public Utilities Section 7-510, electricity purchased from your electric company is termed standard offer service, and electricity sold to larger commercial customers is termed Type 2 standard offer service. This electricity is procured through a competitive bidding process overseen by the Commission. The latest auction was conducted on June 11, 2018 for Type 2 electricity for the period from 1 September to 30 November 2018, and staff presented the bid analysis and bill impacts to the Commission during a hearing on June 14, 2018. For the Potomac Electric Power Company, when comparing to the prior year, Type 2 commercial customers in the LGS class will experience an increase of 7.8%, while the SGS-S and GSP class bills will decrease from 1.5% and 5.8%. For Delmarva Power, when compared to the prior years, the class MGT2-3A and MGT2-LV commercial customers will see increases from 0.47 to 5.02%. Staff has verified that the bill impacts are consistent with those presented to the Commission during the June 14, 2018 hearing. Staff recommends for the Potomac Electric Power Company that the Commission accept the revised tariff pages for filing with an effective date of September 1, 2018. Type 2 standard offer service rates will be effective from September 1, 2018 through November 30, 2018. And for Delmarva Power and Light Company, staff recommends that the Commission accept the revised Type 2 standard offer service rates for filing with an effective date of September 1, 2018.
Thank you, Mr. Dean. Do commissioners have questions on either the Delmarva or Pepco filings? Is there a motion?
Yes, Mr. Chairman, with respect to items 8 and 9, I move we accept the tariff revisions for filing with an effective date of September 1st, 2018.
Is there a second?
Second.
All in favor of both motions?
Aye.
Both motions are approved.
Thank you.
Item number 10 is Baltimore Gas and Electric Company, filed on July 27, 2018, Sub 448 to PSC MD G9 BGE Stride tariff revision. The company proposes tariff language in Rider 16, case number 9331.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman and Commissioners. Annette Garofalo on behalf of Commission staff. This is a proposed tariff filed by Baltimore Gas and Electric Company to revise that portion of its gas tariff applicable to the company's STRIDE program. Under Public Utilities Article Section 4210, a gas company with an approved STRIDE program may recover costs through a surcharge based on estimated costs. Although the statute provides for caps by customer class, over and under collections may still occur due to the nature of STRIDE replacement work. The STRIDE legislation provides that where the actual cost of a STRIDE plan is less than the amount collected for the plan, the difference is to be refunded to customers with interest. The Commission sets the annual surcharge in December of each year based on a project list for the coming year. Each March, collections are trued up based on actual numbers for the previous calendar year. This will result in either an under or an over collection. BGE's new tariff language is intended to assure that interest is charged only to over collections. Staff believes this is appropriate and recommends the Commission accept BGE's proposed tariff changes for filing with an effective date of August 26, 2018.
Thank you, Ms. Garofalo. Any questions for the staff team? Seeing none, is there a motion?
Mr. Chairman, I move the Commission accept the tariff revisions for filing with an effective date of August 26, 2018.
Thank you. Is there a second?
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
The motion is approved.
The next item is item 11, Delmarva Power and Light Company, filed on July 26, 2018, an errata to tariffs to correct a rate design error and request for expedited treatment, case number 9455.
Ms. Secretary, I'm sorry. Can I ask that items 12 and 13 be brought ahead of item number 11?
Yes, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you.
I will call items 12 and 13 together. Item 12 is Joel Horowitz, filed on July 23, 2018, a request for action to require removal of retired copper wire telephone facilities. And item 13 is Oakland Mills Community Association, filed on June 7, 2018, request to take appropriate action to require the removal of abandoned above-ground copper wire facilities.
Yes, I should begin, Mr. Chairman?
Yes.
Yes. We'll have staff begin first. Thank you.
Good morning again, Mr. Chairman, Commissioners. Lloyd Spivak for the Commission staff. Item numbers 12 and 13 are filings by Mr. Joel Hurwitz and the Oakland Mills Community Association, requesting that the Commission take action to require Verizon to remove above-ground abandoned telecommunications facilities. The requests include photographs of damaged equipment in the Columbia, Maryland area. Staff has been in communication with all parties to ensure that the immediate issue was resolved, and Verizon provided staff with photographic evidence that it had fixed the pedestal highlighted in Mr. Hurwitz's and the Association's filings on June 15, 2018. That photo was also included in Verizon's filed responses. Verizon filed responses to both the Oakland Mills Association and Mr. Hurwitz, outlining a plan of action regarding the village of Oakland Mills and surrounding area, specifically proposing to conduct a physical inspection of all Verizon facilities in the area and provide feedback to the staff regarding the inspection. Verizon has also set up a temporary email address dedicated to the Oakland Mills community in the hopes that people, officials, and community associations will provide it with additional information on potentially damaged equipment in the area. Staff expects that the feedback provided through Verizon's investigation will include, at a minimum, the total number and type of facilities inspected, the number and type of facilities requiring repair, the number and type of facilities requiring replacement, and the number of requests made through the dedicated email system. Staff recommends that the Commission direct Verizon to file the results of its facilities inspection on or before October 31st, 2018.
Thank you, Mr. Spivak. Would you like to make an appearance?
Yes.
Please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm Joel Hurwitz. Thank you for hearing this request to address the problem of community aesthetics after a telephone company retires its copper wire telephone and turns on the switch at a wire center. I'll talk about the legal and regulatory issues, and Paul Verchinsky from Oakland Mills Community Association, representing one of the 10 village associations that makes up Columbia, will discuss the village's community concerns with broken telephone boxes. After I learned about the numerous concerns about boxes that they had in Oakland Mills, I asked the Oakland Mills Community Association Board to write a letter of support for this BSC action, and because of the way things were processed, it became a party. I had previously submitted letters of support regarding HB 1568 on the similar issue from Harper's Choice Community Association and the Columbia Association, which included comments on the aesthetic problems of disrepaired telephone boxes. I also submitted emails and photos from the Oakland Mills Community Association and the Owen Brown Community Association to show that communities view broken boxes as a concern. In addition, I submitted individual complaints about boxes made through Howard County's C-Click Fix complaint platform, and all this to show that boxes were an ongoing concern in Columbia and Howard County from a number of individuals for several years. I appreciate Verizon's plans to survey its facilities and engage, as they said, with key stakeholders, including members of the Maryland legislature and county leadership. However, who have they contacted and when? As of Monday afternoon, Delegate Terry Hill's office was still not aware of any contacts, and neither had the Director of Intergovernmental Affairs for the Howard County Executive been contacted on these issues. I've also been inquiring with my Delegate Eric Ebersol's staff for the last month or so. They haven't received anything either. Generally, I welcome Verizon's step to survey its copper wire facilities in Columbia. However, this does not, of course, address the wider issues of the current copper wire retirements in 4 other communities, Bethesda, Glen Burnie, Rockville, and Towson, or any future retirements by Verizon. The results of this survey will be improvement over what was told by Delegate Hill, who had told in her conversations with Verizon that they had not mapped the boxes in Columbia and did not know exactly where they were all located, and it was suggested that any residents would need to make complaints about each individual problem box. Verizon states that they'll be conducting a physical inspection of the facilities in the entire village of Oakland Mills and surrounding area. But what is the extent of the surrounding area? At a minimum, it must include all the areas subject to the retirement notice served by the Wire Center on West Runningbrook Road. Generally, I support the staff recommendation to file the results of the Verizon facilities inspection by October 31st, with the caveat that if additional time is needed, that Verizon provide preliminary information and a summary status of the inspections and the numbers remaining with any requests for additional time that they make before the Commission. Yet, after the survey, Verizon will determine, I suspect, whether it be 1, 10, 100, or 1,000 boxes like the one in my letter that was outside Meriwether Post Pavilion, which was removed, that they no longer serve a function in the telephone system in Columbia. What exactly are Verizon's plans for the retired facilities after the switch to the Wire Center is turned down? Do they plan to remove them, pull the wires, sell to a competitive local exchange carrier, or use them, as they mentioned, for fiber hubs? Also regarding these plans, what is the current status of Verizon's plans to turn down the switch to 5 wire centers on or after June 1st of 2018, as stated in the retirement notice? Essentially, how much has that been delayed as they continue to process changes from customers? Over the years, Verizon has taken a somewhat inconsistent position regarding the plans for fiber transition. In 2007, prior to the FCC's rules on fiber transition, Verizon did recognize the aesthetic issues that I found in at least 2 memoranda. Quote, in some instances, Verizon does remove the copper drop line running from a telephone pole to the side of a customer's home when it installs fiber, in part for aesthetic reasons, and in part to reduce truck rolls related to drop lines and become detached. And for the record, this was in the reply comments of Verizon on petitions for reconsideration in the matter of the recommendations of the independent panel reviewing the impact of Hurricane Katrina on communications networks.
Mr. Hurwitz, in present day, how are your communications with Verizon regarding your concerns? Have they been responsive?
That has never really been the issue. It was a larger issue of what's going to happen to the boxes once the fiber transition is complete, because they're already a little bit decayed now. So the wider issue, and was subject of HB 1568, was what happens in a whole community once the Wire Center switch is turned down, and that these boxes, which some are so old that they still have Chesapeake Potomac stickers on them, what is the plan for the above-ground facilities?
Is Verizon's counsel in the hearing room today? Would you like to take the podium, ma'am, respond to some of the concerns of Mr. Hurwitz?
Well, good morning, Mr. Chairman and Commissioners. Susan Paiva. I am counsel for Verizon. And I actually have brought with me our subject matter expert on this issue, so I would let him answer your questions and speak to this. But I would say, just generally, we do agree with the staff's recommendation on reasonable resolution of this issue.
Okay.
Mr. Wood, Philip Wood, is our subject matter expert.
Mr. Wood, could you just respond to Mr. Hurwitz's request for what are the plans for some of these boxes that may no longer be needed or used?
Yeah, I think, so with respect to our actions when we retire the copper plant, we're committed to providing service to our customers using the network facilities that we have available. And in the instances when we're investing in fiber, that doesn't mean that copper or that does not mean that we're replacing the entire network. So copper is a big part of our network, and it will remain parts of our network for a long time. Our service in Maryland will be built on fiber and copper platforms. The engineering of our network is very complex, and it's evolved over many decades. And so, as a consequence, there are interdependencies within the network. So it's not each municipality is not a standalone network. So because we're investing heavily in the area, it doesn't necessarily mean that what we're going to do is replace every piece of the network in that area. The engineering of the network is done to maximize the efficiency that we can in the network. So basically, there are certain things that, and Columbia is a very good example. So there are, in the area that we're talking about here, we have notified customers for the Columbia Central Office that serves a certain number of customers. The area known as Columbia is actually served by four central offices in total. So there are interdependencies, if you will, in the part of Columbia that mean there will be pieces of that area that will always be, well, I shouldn't say always, that will be remaining on copper. As a result, we don't pull necessarily the equipment out of the network. What we do is we continue to maintain it, and we're committed to maintaining that plant. There are certain areas where when we do convert to fiber, as Mr. Hurwitz stated, we do in fact repurpose the network. So for example, there are what we call service area terminals, and those would be like the larger rectangular boxes that you might see. We'll repurpose those into a fiber hub if it makes sense. And it makes sense not just from a business perspective because it's utilizing the network, but it also helps the municipality because we're not tearing up streets or rights of way that we already have available to us. So what we try to do is engineer the network in a manner that's efficient, that uses the capabilities that we have as well as the network facilities. And I think that's something that I think the FCC has acknowledged as well, to give us the opportunity to engineer the network in a responsible way that puts us in a position where we can continue to invest in our network and fiber and maintain our service and equipment for our customers.
Thank you. I think you responded. Let me also ask if People's Counsel is in the room and would like to add anything additionally.
Thank you, Your Honor. Anna Ryan for the Office of People's Counsel. And as part of this discussion, certainly People's Counsel understands the concerns of communities who are, looking at some apparently abandoned equipment on the part of Verizon. But we would like to reiterate that Verizon not only has the opportunity provided by the FCC to transition to fiber from copper, but as it does so, it has the obligation to maintain the copper facilities in all of the phases, whether they are being used to provide end-user services, direct end-user customers, or whether they are being used at some point in the transportation of communications. And so we simply want to reiterate that we want Verizon to continue to maintain those copper facilities until they are no longer being used for any purpose. And given the complexity of the network, many of these boxes may need to continue to be maintained even if it appears to customers that those copper facilities aren't being used. And for that reason, we find the staff's recommendation about continued monitoring of this situation and continued reporting from Verizon to be reasonable.
Thank you, Ms. Ryan. Mr. Edelson? I'm sorry. Are you with Oakland Mills?
Yes, I am. I have vision issues. If I may, Mr. Chairman, I'd like to sit at the front table.
Please do.
Okay.
If you could just turn on your microphone in front of you.
I think it's on.
Looks like it's on. There's a green light.
Right. Please identify yourself.
Yes. Good morning, Mr. Chairman, Commissioners. Paul Verchinsky, 5475 Sleeping Dog Lane, Columbia. I am a board member of the OMCA Homeowners Association. We have 9,900 members. I am authorized to comment on behalf of the Oakland Mills Board. Thank you for your expeditious follow-up to our letter. We would like to endorse the staff report that directs Verizon to file the results of its facilities inspection on or before October 31st, 2018, we would also request that we get a copy of that particular report or any subsequent reports. I had a chance to use the email setup noted in the Verizon letter, Oakland Mills at one.verizon.com. I received a response on Monday which raised the following suggestions as a result of the report that I put in. This email should be maintained by Verizon indefinitely, since this is a continuing issue. And Verizon, in its letter of July 20th, in fact states that, and I quote, "One of the many challenges with managing Verizon's vast field-deployed network is that we cannot monitor each specific piece of equipment all the time. Our field equipment is often damaged by routine landscaping, excavation work, automobile accidents, and public works, such as road repaving, to name just a few. And unless the public contacts us, we sometimes will not know about a damaged piece of field equipment until a technician is working nearby." They also further state retiring copper lines and decommissioning a Verizon switch can take years to complete, and even when that process is concluded, our field deployed equipment such as pedestals, cross boxes, and the like will continue to serve active Verizon customers. That is one suggestion, that you keep this email active indefinitely. Verizon should mark its towers with waterproof tape as Verizon-telephone. Right now it's impossible to determine which are Verizon's telephone and which are cable. These metal mushrooms are all over the place. I'm sure you've seen them in your own neighborhood. Some are fiber cable boxes, others are telephone. With all Verizon telephone boxes marked, we can then know the others are cable boxes, which is not the PSC's responsibility. So with that, we'd like to make those suggestions, and I entertain any questions.
Thank you, Mr. Porchinsky. Do the commissioners have questions of any of the parties before us? Commissioner O'Donnell.
Let me start with Mr. Hurwitz. Mr. Chairman, thank you, Mr. Hurwitz, for being here today.
Thank you.
I wanted to ask you about, and then I'm going to ask Verizon to respond, ask you about the outreach that you alluded to. I was a little confused because I thought you said there was no outreach to Delegate Dr. Hill.
And Monday I asked her staff, she still hadn't received anything, so I
haven't finished yet. But yet you later alluded to a conversation that she had with Verizon's, and she related that to you. So can you help me out with that kind of?
That was back during the General Assembly session when she was dealing with HB 1568.
Okay.
So I've been asking her office. I had one email with her while she was on vacation a week or two ago. They haven't received anything, so I don't know if there's any email, if they sent it to their box in Annapolis.
Thank you.
I can't find, and people, I don't know who they're trying to contact at Howard County.
Let me ask Verizon, do you have any outreach going on?
Yeah, so I appreciate that question. There's a couple things that we've been working towards. With respect to the community at large, we have some external affairs managers that are pretty active in the Howard County area, and that includes socializing the email address and having these discussions with the local leadership there. With respect to Delegate Hill and perhaps others at the legislature, I know that we have not under my purview, but there are personnel that handle our relationships in Annapolis. Subject to check, I can tell you that at least one representative, and I believe it was Delegate Hill, but again, subject to check, we reached out to her staff at least a week or two ago to set up a meeting with her, and I think we were told that she was on vacation and that we are going to get back with her when her schedule permits. I don't think that date has been set up. I'd be happy to share that with you when the time comes.
Not necessarily.
Okay.
I do think it's important, I'll just say this, to reach out to the local elected officials, the state legislators, the county council folks, to the extent possible. It goes a long way in helping to create mutual understanding about, your mandates from both the federal and the state, federal government and the state government and what you have to do to maintain your plant. So I would just encourage Verizon to continue to do that. Thank you. Just one other question for Mr. Hurwitz, if I might, Mr. Chairman. You alluded twice now to House Bill 1568. What's the status of that bill?
Well, since the session ended, it died in committee.
Given an unfavorable report?
Yes,
Okay.
partly because it was, I guess, over broadly drafted with regard to electric companies, and the majority of the committee didn't feel it was an issue.
Fair enough. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Commissioner Richard?
Yeah, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Just for the company, I just would like to understand just your, I guess, your maintenance or how you maintain your facilities out there. These they were referred to as the mushrooms. Do you have a program on your own that you go out and take the initiative to regularly inspect, or is that just something that's taken care of on a complaint basis?
Sure. I think there's a couple of ways that we do it. So, and first of all, I can speak to this through experience because I actually began my career as a technician, climbing poles, digging holes, if you will, driving around and providing service to our customers. And I think on a regular basis, what we do when we're out on jobs is we look for things that, such as the pedestal, and to the extent that we see those things, there's a means by which our employees can identify them and get them, quote, repaired if they exist. And I would say that I think, while frankly, and I'll be very candid here, I think that when I was notified of this particular pedestal by staff, you know what, it's not acceptable, and I think every one of our employees would agree with that. That said, I can tell you with certainty that it was the exception. It is not the norm.
Okay, and I was going to ask a question about that. Did you have a specific standard that you have set?
Yeah,
if your people see them out in the field,
absolutely,
you know
we do. Our technicians have tablets, our employees have apps and so forth that we use to communicate and try to make sure that those things are identified and fixed. And I would say that, so in preparation for this, one of the things I also did was I went back to so we have a system where we can look at the number of customer feedback, whether it be complaints that we have in the state of Maryland, for example. And there are very, very, very few customer complaints in the state of Maryland in general. There are even fewer as it relates to outside plant type of equipment. So that tells me that we're doing a pretty good job. I do think that, again, and I think I referenced it, and Mr. Hurwitz quoted the letter, I think, you know, we do have a vast network, and so we do rely upon a number of ways for us to identify these types of situations. Our employees, our technicians certainly, and to the extent that we get customer feedback, frankly, we like that. And it's not uncommon for a customer to call our service line and say, hey, look, I was mowing the lawn and I backed my tractor into a pedestal, and we'll go out and fix it. Or that there's a low-hanging wire, a tree branch came down, and we go out and fix it. So that is a means by which we get information, and frankly, I would tell you it's a valuable means.
Great. And you do support, the company supports the recommendation of staff about providing the results of the inspection by late October.
I do, and I'd probably...
And would that be available to the public as well? Would that be something that the company would have no problem making available to the public?
Subject to check. I think that's reasonable. I think we've talked about that with staff. And
okay. And the other question, the final question is, you probably have read the OPC filing. They specifically suggest that I guess it's the result of the inspection, but I guess they're implying that this should be more of a report. And I guess I can ask the OPC this, but they suggest that in this filing on October 31st, 2018, it should include the number and type of facilities requiring repair, the number and type of facilities requiring replacement, the number of requests made through the dedicated email, and information regarding additional repair or removal of facilities. At this time, did your inspection, did you intend to include that? And if we were to ask for that information, would that be difficult or onerous for the company to provide?
I think generally speaking, that's kind of what our intent was. I think it's hard for me to answer that question specifically until I see the feedback, but I think in general, the parameters that are outlined there are fair for us to communicate that feedback to. And I think our field personnel are working towards making sure that I have the appropriate documentation to, be consistent with that request.
Okay, so all that specific information could be required of the company without any concern today.
Subject to check, I think it's reasonable for us to look at those parameters and be able to do that, yes.
Okay, great, thank you.
Commissioner Herman.
So, a couple of questions. Mr. Perchinsky talked about asking that the email site be maintained. If the email site were not to be maintained, how is it that customers are expected to provide the feedback about backing their tractor into a pedestal?
Well, I think to date, so the email address was set up on a temporary basis, and to date, it's worked fine with people calling 1-800-VERIZON. I think it's fairly common that everybody knows that's how to get a hold of Verizon. And as I said, I don't think we have, there's nothing that indicates that this is a widespread issue. So I don't want to say that it's, quote, needed, because historically it hasn't lent itself to that. As we progress through our inspection of the facilities, I think we'll be able to evaluate that based on our experience in the inspection of Columbia and provide additional feedback when we're done, I suppose.
Do you intend to, the temporary site, will it be in existence at least until after October of 2018?
It's our intent to leave it in place through October, yes.
Okay. And does it say on your website if you have a concern with a facility, this is the number to call? Is that how people generally learn about how to register a complaint with the company?
I'm not sure whether or not it's, quote, on our website, but I think generally speaking, all our communications reference 1-800-VERIZON as a means to get a hold of us, whether it be for billing or service-related issues.
Okay. And a couple of the comments say that, if Verizon can't make the report by the end of October, that it come in and ask for an extension. Can you give me a status on whether you expect that the report would be done in October?
At this point in time, I expect that we will be able to cover the area around the Oakland Mills and won't have any problems meeting that requirement. The caveat there, just to be fair, you know what, if we get 3 hurricanes in the month of September, that might affect our ability to get all the work done.
Okay.
So frankly, that was something that I had shared with staff and asked for the flexibility to be able to adjust our workflow, if you will, as it relates to extraneous factors beyond our control.
Gotcha. And when you say the area around the community, can you clarify what that means? I think that was one of the questions.
So generally speaking, it's the Columbia, Maryland Wire Center.
Okay.
So.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Commissioner Linton.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And for the superstitious of us who will knock on wood that we not have 3 hurricanes in the month of September, for just a question regarding the October 31st date and the report that would come from that, what is the step that the company would plan to take after the report is prepared and finished?
Just to be clear, I think we're taking steps now as we do this inspection, and I'll give you an example. I mean, I've had some feedback from our ops team as they go through, and they've found items. Now, I would tell you that the overwhelming vast majority of the items they have found have been aesthetic in nature. So, and to be clear up front, we have not found any safety or hazard type issues, so which I would not expect. But we are reporting, if you will, in October. That report will be that we have completed what we found. So we're not just doing the inspections, we're doing the work, which is part of the reason, frankly, I think I appreciate having the latitude to have the time to do it. So we're getting people out there, and if they find a situation, we're fixing it, and that will be in the report.
Okay, so this is not just a status report or an inspection report, but it's actually a report that would demonstrate or state to the parties that are interested that the any matters or issues that the company has found as part of your inspection is resolved.
Absolutely. And one caveat might be if we find something that requires a level of, if we have to replace a pedestal and we need a right-of-way, if there's a time gap there, obviously that would, may inhibit our ability to get it done by October 31st. But if that's the case, I'll be clear enough to identify that. I should have enough information to be very clear about that.
Okay. Thank you.
Yes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Seeing no additional questions, is there a motion?
Yes, Mr. Chairman, but first, I was going to propose to the commissioners that maybe a slight amendment to the motion that we were going to consider, and it would read something along the lines that this would be, I'm not making the motion, I'm just stating what I was going to suggest we amend it to state. Direct the Verizon Maryland LLC to file the results of the report on of its facilities inspection, and the report should include, basically this just comes from the Office of People's Counsel recommendations, the number and type of facilities requiring repair, the number and type of facilities requiring replacement, the number of requests made through the dedicated email, and information regarding additional repair or removal of facilities on or before October 31st, 2018. That was going to be my suggested amendment to the motion before us.
Any commissioners have concerns with Commissioner Richards' proposal?
Could I ask the company to weigh in on that recommendation before we vote on it, Mr. Chairman?
I'd be happy to. Being overly prescriptive in what I can provide without being the person doing the work out in the field is difficult. I do believe, as I indicated, Commissioner, that we'll be able to satisfy those. So I'd prefer not having a prescription, and I believe I certainly have Council's memo and certainly your comments on the record, and you have my word that if we have that information, you'll see it in the report. I can't imagine why we won't, but again, because I'm not out doing the work and I haven't done that level of prescriptive detail with the folks doing the work, I don't want to create a situation where I'm having them go back and redo 4 weeks of work to, satisfy a particular piece that they may not have been looking at.
Oh, so the work is underway?
This work, you know what, my bad, I should have made that clear. We started this work in the middle of July, I believe it was. So we have been well underway. If I had to make a guess, we are 2/3 of the way done.
Okay.
Staff have a comment on the recommendation as suggested?
Good morning, Chairman, Commissioners. Jennifer Ward on behalf of staff. I think that as long as we're getting their report with as much information as they have, then it's reasonable and we can look at it at that time. If we see that there's not enough for us to make a determination at that time, we could always ask for more, or at least as much as they have.
Well, let me just ask OPC, why did you include that recommendation in your filing?
Certainly. We included those specifics, I believe, to be consistent with staff's recommendation. And those seem to be the types of information that should be available as they go through this process. And that's basically what we're looking for, is some sort of reporting of the metrics of what they've done throughout this process, if there is anything left to be done that they aren't able to conclude by October 31st. So those seemed like reasonable metrics to ask for, reasonable statistics to ask for. If there are other statistics that can also represent the progress that they have made throughout this period, those would also be helpful, or alternatively be helpful.
Okay, I guess it would be helpful to me to know, are you satisfied with the company simply trying to make its best efforts and not prescribing in an amendment that...
I think I would agree with the staff that if they can provide the best information that they get as a result of this, and then by October 31st, when we see what they have, if we determine gaps within that information, then we can decide what additional information we might need to fill in those gaps.
Okay.
Mr. Chairman,
one moment. Commissioner O'Donnell.
Well, I was just going to suggest one way to approach this might be that we could also amend onto your suggested prescription. If that information is not available, please justify why it's not in the report. That way, if it's not available, then we can at least get an explanation.
Well, and I tend to agree now that if their inspection is already underway, but yeah, I think that would be a reasonable addition.
I don't disagree that it should, to the extent that information is available, provide all that information. I just want to be not prescriptive that that's all, if there's additional information, that it also include that. So therefore, I'm comfortable with the motion as it stands, with the company's commitment that we've had here today, that they're going to provide all that information, and as much information as they are finding, they're going to provide in this report. And so therefore, I just wanted to make sure that we didn't preclude the inclusion of something.
Yeah.
Okay, so we will accept Verizon's commitment and word.
Thank you.
To provide that information without being as prescriptive, but to the extent you can provide that information in that detail, we will expect that, subject to any future concerns brought by our staff council.
And I'm likewise, I'm satisfied with our colloquy today on the issue. I think we've all expressed our interest in getting as much information as possible, so I would withdraw my amendment to the proposed, or at least the recommended motion, and I am prepared, if you'd like, to go ahead and make the motion.
Thank you. Mr. Hurwitz, briefly.
All right, well, because of the way this got processed with Oakland Mills, it's just going to not very intuitive for the people outside of the village of Oakland Mills that they're going to write the email to the Oakland Mills dedicated address. So going forward, that seemed to be an issue. And my bigger issue, it's never been about a particular box or a particular neighborhood. It was the greater thing once the wire center was turned down and turned off. And I recognize with the OPC, the company keeps saying that there's some of them being used. I'm assuming, going by what the company has written, that they're eventually going to turn off the wire center. They wrote to you 2 years ago that following the copper date and migration to all customers off copper, Verizon will have authorization from the FCC to retire the copper, including possibly removing and salvaging it, and turn on the switch and serve the copper facilities.
Mr. Hurwitz, what is your bottom line here?
Well, and the notice says they're going to cease to maintain the facilities once they turn down the switch. So let's assume eventually they're going to finish the copper migration. They've done their survey. They've turned off the switch on West Running Brook Road. What is their plans for the facilities a year from now, 5 years from now, that are no longer serving any function because the copper wire center no longer functions and they're not serving any copper customers from that wire center? So that's always been, where do we go after we get the survey?
I suspect they'll cross that bridge when they come to it, but if Verizon has a brief response to Mr. Hurwitz.
I think I agree with you, and I also think that the FCC has issued a number of orders, and we're very, very carefully monitoring and obeying and being compliant with all the requirements that the FCC has laid out with respect to the copper retirement. So,
thank you. Is there a motion based on Mr. Hurwitz and Oakland Mills Community Association's filings?
Yes, Mr. Chairman. For items number 12 and 13, I move we direct Verizon Maryland LLC to file the results of its facilities inspection on or before October 31st, 2018.
Thank you. Is there a second?
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. The motion for both items 12 and 13 are approved. At this point, we're going to take a brief recess, reconvening at 11:35 a.m. I would ask interested parties for that matter before the commission to approach and sit at the table. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
hair look all right? My hair look good?
You look great, buddy.
Thanks. Madam Secretary, if you could call the next item, please.
The last item on the agenda is Delmarva Power and Light Company, filed on July 26, 2018, errata tariffs to correct rate design error and request for expedited treatment, case number 9455.
Thank you. Can we just take appearances beginning, Mr. Spivak?
Thank you. Good morning again, Mr. Chairman. Commissioners, Lloyd Spivak for the Commission staff. With me is David Hoppick, the Assistant Director for the Electricity Division, and also Jamie Smith, the Chief Accountant, and Philip Vanderhayden, the Director of the Electricity Division.
Thank you.
Anna Ryan for the Office of People's Counsel.
Douglas E. Mikeel appearing on behalf of Delmarva Power and Light Company. Mr. Chairman, today with me I have Kevin McGowan, the Vice President of Regulatory. To my immediately left, I have Jay Zeminski, the Director of Regulatory Strategy and Revenue Policy, and right next to Mr. Zeminski is Mr. Joe Janoka, the Manager of Retail Rates.
Behind you?
Mr.
Yes.
McGowan.
Okay. All right. There we go. Mr. Spivak, take it away.
Thank you. Delmarva Power and Light has filed tariff revisions to correct an error made by the company in its tariffs. The tariffs in question were filed on February 9th as compliance filing upon Commission approval of the unanimous stipulation and settlement between Delmarva, Commission staff, and the Office of People's Counsel, and had previously been filed in draft form as part of the settlement filing. According to Delmarva, the company made a calculation error by failing to include the full impact of the approved revenues of the prior Delmarva Power base rate case, that's case number 9424, in the final rates submitted to the Commission in case number 9455 and approved by order number 88567 issued on February 9th. The amount of the error is $12.14 million. The residential bill impact of this would be an additional $3.30 per month, which would more than double the increase that was testified to in case 9455. On August 7th, Delmarva filed proposed corrections to its July 26th filing after staff called an error to their attention. The rate design error apparently occurred because Delmarva failed to make an additional adjustment in its adjusted test year distribution revenue to reflect the change in its bill stabilization adjustment revenues per customer per month approved in case 9424. Staff's and eventually the Commission's response to Delmarva's filing must address four broad issues, each of which has some unusual aspects. The first issue is ascertaining whether the numbers Delmarva has presented as of its last filing are now correct. The second issue is whether the Commission has the legal ability to reopen one of its final rate case orders to correct a factual error in the record 6 months after the Commission issued its final order and 5 months after the appeal and rehearing deadlines have passed. Assuming the answer on the last issue is yes, the third issue is whether the Commission should do so. And finally, if the Commission is inclined to do as Delmarva requests, the fourth issue is what procedure would best accomplish this and result in an order that can withstand a legal challenge in court. Staff has recommended that the Commission suspend the tariff for 45 days because we do not yet have our answers on all these issues. The one thing that is very clear here is that a new rate case would be the cleanest way of authorizing revised rates with the fewest avenues for legal challenges. Staff believes the number is now correct, however, we would like to do additional analysis. Staff is getting to the point where we might agree that the Commission has the legal authority to reopen an erroneous order, at least in the case of an error of law, but as Delmarva correctly pointed out in its filing Monday, we are looking at an error of fact here. With regard to whether the Commission should do as Delmarva requests, the answer rests primarily on interpretation of the settlement and whether one believes the agreed on revenue increase or the agreed rates should be controlling, or if they carry equal weight, where do the equities lie? Speaking on procedure, as I just stated, the error can certainly be rectified in a new rate case. It is possible that this could be done with the authorization of a regulatory asset until that case is over, although a regulatory asset, even one without a return component, as might be appropriate here, would increase the potential for rate shock at the end of the case. Another option would be to hold a hearing to supplement the record in case 9455, which, contrary to Delmarva's assertion, does not now contain all the evidence that should be there to support the decision Delmarva is requesting. Staff is still investigating and deliberating to determine what our ultimate recommendation will be, and that is why we are recommending the additional suspension days. Beyond explaining what's behind staff's procedural recommendation, I would like to take this opportunity to respond to a number of points raised in Delmarva's response to staff's comments. Delmarva states that it is Delmarva Power's position that staff and OPC agreed to a revenue requirement based on $222.5 million total sales revenues. In fact, that number is not found in the settlement, nor in any of the testimony supporting the settlement, nor in the Commission order approving it, though it is a number you can arrive at mathematically. Delmarva claims that staff does not contest that the correct information was included in the record. Staff agrees that an almost correct revenue adjustment and the correct revenue increase are in the record, but the correct rates are not. In fact, the rates that are currently in the record are the incorrect rates in the existing tariff testified to by Delmarva's witness. The fact of the error, information about the origin of the error, and information about how the error was discovered and why it took five months are also not in the existing evidentiary record. Neither is information regarding the interplay of Delmarva's mistake here and the adjustment made to Delmarva's rates to account for the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. Delmarva more than implies that staff has been dilatory in its review of this filing because we've had the information for 2 months. It is true that Delmarva first came to staff with the information regarding their mistake on or about June 19th, at which time they stated the amount of the error as being over $13 million. After a month of discovery and discussion with staff, they actually made their filing with the Commission. The filing contained a correction to the correction, which flowed from Delmarva's discussions with staff about the proper methodology for calculating the amount of the error. On August 7th, after staff propounded a data request, the company found an error in the tariff sheets for the high-pressure sodium street lighting tariff, and they filed another errata. Given that we are now on the third iteration of Delmarva's mistake, it should not be surprising that staff is somewhat reluctant to claim certainty with regard to the accuracy of the current $12.14 million figure. Delmarva states that the company is not seeking to introduce new evidence into the record of this proceeding. Unfortunately, that may well be exactly what needs to happen before the Commission can reasonably grant Delmarva's request. More specifically, all the information that has been put before the Commission in these various filings should be placed in evidence and subject to cross-examination by the parties and the Commission. Finally, Delmarva takes note of staff's statement that we have conducted discovery in this matter and have not claimed that Delmarva has been unresponsive. For the record, Delmarva has been reasonably forthcoming and cooperative on the discovery we have done so far. But saying that staff has already done substantial discovery and Delmarva has answered is not the same as saying that staff has finished its discovery in this matter. Accordingly, staff stands by its request that the Commission suspend the proposed tariffs for a minimum of 45 days from today. I note also that OPC has filed comments recommending that the Commission reject the Delmarva request, but we'll let them explain their position.
Thank you. Counsel for Delmarva, Mr. McKeel.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. First of all, if staff took from our letter that we believe that the staff had been dilatory in their work, that was not what I was attempting to express in the letter. In fact, I think the staff, particularly Mr. Hoppick, Mr. Smith, Mr. Vanderhayden, Ms. Garofalo, and Ms. Spivak, or Mr. Spivak, have been very responsive to the company. They have been inquisitive. They have asked questions. They have, done appropriate discovery, and I believe that they have done their level best to understand what occurred here and get to the bottom of it. So I just wanted to start out with an overall that that's not what we're saying. What we were saying, though, in the letter is that we've had 60 days, and I don't think we need another 5 weeks to get to that point to where we need to be. I think we are willing to take a suspension of another 2 weeks to, make sure the numbers are correct and the like. But I don't think we need the 45 days. So that's at first. Mr. Spivak indicated 4 reasons. First of all, the numbers are correct. I think with the filings that we have made, and I can have Mr. Zeminski walk the commission through the numbers as to how the error was made, and Mr. Janoka explain how the error was made in the rate design portion, and I think the numbers are correct. I think, without a doubt, this commission has the legal ability to change its orders. I have cited Section 3.113B, that the commission has the authority to modify its orders, and certainly the commission has the authority to modify its orders, I believe, when there's been a mistake of fact or a mistake of law. And I guess, mistakes go both ways. Unfortunately, in this mistake, we made a mistake and the revenue requirement is too low, but certainly if the revenue requirement was too high and a mistake was made, I think the commission has the authority to do that. And I think the commission, based on our presentation, should do that. I guess I would just turn it over quickly to Mr. Janoka and Mr. Zeminski to kind of explain the nature of the error, how it occurred, where it is in the record, and we can go from there.
Yes. Mr. Zeminski, Chair, I would like to sort of go review some of the numbers that were in our July 26th filing in Attachment B. And just sort of as a background, in terms of the context of rate making, there's a revenue requirement number, and there's revenues and expenses and rate base and items that go into that part of a rate case. That determines what a rate increase or decrease can be in a case. On a parallel path, revenues are also used to design the rates that customers will pay. So coming out of a rate case, again, the revenue requirement side deals with the increase, and revenues are an input to that, and we'll get to that in a minute. And then whatever revenues are in there and whatever revenue increase comes out of a rate case, that's where rate design would come in and use those revenues to determine what rates are in an applicable class. So in terms of the Attachment B on the July 26 filing of the company, the numbers that we're displaying here, on the first column on the left, this deals with sort of the numbers that were part of the revenue requirement process. So these were the revenues used as an input to determine what the rate increase that the parties ultimately settled upon. First sections under annualized revenue in case 9455, the case in question. There's billed revenues, there's BSA-related revenues, and then there is an annualization adjustment because of the fact that the rate increase in the prior case took place in the middle of the test period in the case which is in question. So what that means from a rate-making perspective is some of our test period has the approved revenue from that last case in it, some of our test period does not. So since we already know we've got that rate increase, we don't need to ask for it twice, so we make a rate-making adjustment to put those revenues in to make the rate effective period reflect that. Add all the numbers together, and we were talking about the revenues that would be used for rate design purposes, that comes to about $210 million, as evidenced by the approved revenue requirement column on the left-hand side. The parties then worked through a settlement in case 9455. In that case, the starting point for those negotiations was sort of the last position that the company had, which was a revenue requirement all-encompassing of $19 million. Included in that were the revenues related to the annualization of revenues in the prior case, the same thing I just talked about on that last line, the $13.9 million. So in the context of rate making, those are revenues that we already got. So the $13.9 million was essentially a reduction to our revenue requirement ask in the $19 million overall ask, final position. So the revenue requirement would actually have been higher if that uncontested adjustment, and it was uncontested by all the parties, wasn't in the mix. So in terms of where we ultimately settled in the case, it was $13.4 million increase. So the ultimate level of sales revenue that's the parties essentially agreed to embedded in the revenue requirement was the 223.5. The middle column, and I'll let sort of Joe talk through that.
223.5 or 222.5?
I'll get to that. 223.5, and then I'll make the bridge to the 222.5, and then I'll let Mr. Janoka talk about the rate design. So again, 223.5 is what was embedded essentially as a revenue input in terms of what the parties agreed to in the settlement. That was based on the $13.9 million that you see for the case 9424 annualization adjustment was based on estimated billing determinants. We didn't have them in terms of being able to put them into the revenue requirements during the course of the case. As part of the discovery in this proceeding, when the error was discovered, Mr. Janoka's team went back, did all their calculations using actual billing determinants, and found that the estimated amount of 13.9 was actually 12.9 million. And so it reduces the revenue requirement by 1 million. And that's the only sort of moving piece, essentially, that drives us going from a $23.5 million increase, essentially that was what the parties were working with in the context of the settlement, to the 22.5 that you see on the corrected revenue for rate design column on the right-hand side, in terms of where we are right now. So that's in terms of how the revenue requirement, the revenues, the sales revenues that were embedded in the revenue requirement throughout the case, through the settlement negotiations, that's sort of how they have moved over time and what their components are. And then Mr. Janoka will talk as to the middle column. So again, 223.5 that was essentially in the settlement, and the 222.5 that is what we have now. That's revenue requirements. That's the dollars that were sort of agreed to in the settlement. And then from that, those dollars need to then be taken and, from a rate design perspective, figured out how those revenues would be allocated to the different customer classes. And that's where the error occurred. I'll let Joe take over.
Right. Yes, Commissioners, good morning. It's still morning. Yes, so as Mr. Zeminski explained, in developing the revenue requirement, an adjustment was included to reflect the fact that there was a rate change that occurred in the middle of the test period. Unfortunately, that adjustment never found its way through in the rate design calculations, which is the nature of the issue that we have with the tariff rates. We are evaluating and analyzing and assessing, how that issue occurred. But at this point, all we can, we could say that our review of our calculations shows that it didn't occur. Typically, what happens when we file rate cases, my team would be the ones that would actually develop the annualization adjustment, and we would provide that to Mr. Zeminski's team. That process was not used in this case, and I think that kind of led to the misstep between the rate design calculations and the revenue requirement calculations. So, but as shown kind of in that middle column, if you look at where we started coming out of case 9424 and where we ended up coming out of 9455, just in terms of overall revenues, you can see that it's certainly not a $13 million increase. It is something considerably less. So, as I said, I mean, this is difficult to talk about. It's a kind of a hard nut to swallow to kind of explain how this kind of an adjustment or this was missed, but nonetheless it was. I can assure you that I've become very good friends with our internal audit folks, and I'm sure that relationship will continue for the foreseeable future. So, I mean, it's an issue that's being taken seriously, by my team as well as, by the company overall, regardless of what the outcome of this situation is. We are investigating the whole nature of this concern. It's an ongoing evaluation.
Thank you. Ms. Ryan.
Thank you, Your Honor. As has been expressed by the parties already, Delmarva's request to have a modification to its tariff would change the rates that are currently being charged to Delmarva's customers. Those current rates were determined in case number 9455, which concluded with a complete unanimous settlement between Delmarva, OPC, and Commission staff. In the order approving the settlement, the Commission stated that it realized that delicate compromises are often required in order for parties to achieve an uncontested settlement. So I'd like to take a moment and talk about that settlement, in particular the revenue requirement, because Delmarva says that it is not earning the revenue requirement that was agreed to in the settlement. So I'd like to take a look at that, starting with paragraph 2 of the settlement, which is titled Revenue Requirement. It simply states, the company shall file rate schedules authorizing a Maryland retail base rate increase of $13,400,000. A draft copy of the proposed tariff sheets implementing this increase is attached as Exhibit 1. This settlement is what is often referred to as a black box settlement with respect to the revenue requirement, meaning that the methodology used to reach the amount of the revenue requirement is hidden. The use of a black box for revenue requirement facilitates settlement discussions between divergent parties because it minimizes the number of disagreements that have to be resolved during the negotiation process. During the negotiation process, each party in a rate case bears litigation risk on the issues that they have testified to. And from a practical perspective, each party knows that it's likely to win some of its arguments and lose some of its arguments if the case goes to hearing. Therefore, during settlement negotiations, when looking at a black box revenue requirement, each party can envision different ways of reaching that number based on the adjustments that they prioritize and that they think they could win or not if the case were to go to hearing. This allows parties with divergent interests and divergent opinions to reach a delicate balance when they conclude their settlement. This black box nature and the refusal to specifically identify any revenue adjustments is made clear in paragraph 8 of the settlement, which states, quote, none of the parties shall be deemed to have approved, accepted, agreed, consented, or acquiesced to any rate-making principle or procedural principle, including, without limitation, any method of cost or revenue determination or cost allocation or revenue-related methodology. Delmarva's proposed change to the tariff based on its inclusion of RMA 19 in the methodology used to arrive at the revenue requirement would violate this clause. Basically, Delmarva's proposal involves selectively choosing one revenue adjustment that favors it and including it into a settlement that specifically excluded any revenue adjustments in reaching the revenue requirement. What's more, it would also change a term that was specified in the contract, in the settlement agreement, by changing the tariff, which was part of the settlement agreement and was incorporated in paragraph 2 as the settlement states, a draft copy of the proposed tariff sheets implementing the increase is attached as Exhibit 1. Settlements are, of course, contracts, and they tend to be interpreted according to the principles of contract law. The primary principle of contract interpretation is look at the language of the contract and determine if there is any ambiguity in the contract that needs to be interpreted. In this case, there is no ambiguity. The contract, the settlement agreement clearly states we're not agreeing to any specific adjustment or way of getting to the revenue requirement. It also clearly includes the numbers in the tariffs. So there is no ambiguity in this contract that needs to be interpreted or modified. Additionally, one of the primary tenets of contract law is that if there is an ambiguity or something that requires interpretation, the language of the contract is interpreted against the interests of the drafting party. The drafting party in this case was Delmarva. Delmarva had all of the authority, all of the control, all of the power to determine whether or not the numbers included in the tariffs reflected their method of getting to the revenue requirement agreed upon in the settlement agreement. And again, the overall situation here is clear. OPC and staff agreed to a settlement, specific language regarding what was and was not included in the revenue requirement. I'd also like to take a moment to discuss Delmarva's assertion that the Commission has broad authority to modify its orders. Delmarva cites statute for this, but in its letters, Delmarva also cited a case, Radio Communications Inc. versus the PSC, from the Court of Special Appeals. And I want to take a moment to discuss that because the holding in that case is actually quite limited. What the court held in that case, and I quote, "We conclude that there is an affirmative duty upon an administrative agency to correct a prior decision when, because of an error of law, a continued adherence to its erroneous decision would place a litigant at an unfair disadvantage," end quote. So there are three primary distinctions that the court considered when it determined whether or not the Commission had authority to modify a judgment and a final order. And the first of those is who made the error. In Radio Communications, Inc., the Commission made an error, not one of the parties. In this case, the Commission didn't make an error. The Commission issued a final order finding the settlement just and reasonable. There is no accusation by any party in this case that the Commission erred in that decision. The second distinction is the kind of error involved. In Radio Communications, the error that was involved was a legal error. In this case, the error is a factual error. When it comes to standards of review, legal errors and factual errors are considered very differently. And the final distinction is the element of an unfair disadvantage, an unfair advantage. That element actually runs against Delmarva in this case. Delmarva drafted the tariffs. Delmarva had the information. Delmarva is not the one at an unfair disadvantage in this case because they are the ones who made the error. Now, interestingly, the Commission has had this case before it as an authority on a couple of different occasions. There's one in particular of those that I want to talk about, and that was case number 8519F, which is a case that from 1989, and the opinion was written by the hearing examiner. I think it is very educational for how this case authority is addressed in this instance. In that case, Baltimore Thermal Energy Corporation sought recovery through a fuel rate adjustment of expenditures that had been made prior to the period covered by the adjustment period in that case. Baltimore Thermal Energy argued that it should be allowed to recover those amounts even though they predated the recovery period because they were the result of, and I quote, "a mistake or two by BTEC's accountants," end quote. BTEC cited Radio Communications in its argument, but the hearing examiner rejected that as authority and stated that BTEC's reliance on Radio Communications was misplaced. The hearing examiner, then emphasizing the elements of an error of law and an unfair disadvantage, concluded, and I quote, "Here, the Commission correctly applied the law in its earlier decision. The error is BTEC's failure to adduce the facts at the appropriate time. In my opinion, it is fair to place the burden of this mistake on its perpetrator," end quote. OPC would contend that the situation in this case is analogous, and it is fair to put the burden of the error on the party that made that error, in this case, Delmarva. But even assuming, just for the sake of argument, that the Commission does have the authority to make the requested modification, OPC still contends that the Commission would still have discretion about whether or not to use that authority and should still reject Delmarva's request. Settlements and rate cases are in the public interest for a variety of reasons, including that they conserve administrative resources and save ratepayers money. Parties enter into settlements with the expectation that the other parties to the agreement will uphold their end of the bargain. If the Commission can modify any settlement at any time, if one party doesn't like the way the terms of the settlement are playing out, parties will simply have no incentive to enter settlements. Settlement negotiations require time and resources from each party and are only successful when the settling parties can be confident that the settlement will be enacted as agreed upon. Uncertainty as to the finality of settlements will leave parties in the position of having to litigate each specific element of a rate case in order to know that the final order in a rate case is, in fact, final. So there's a really simple solution here, and staff has already mentioned it. If Delmarva feels it's not earning sufficient revenue, there is a procedure in place for it to remedy that situation, and that is that it can file a rate case.
Thank you, Ms. Ryan. You make a lot of arguments in your appearance today. I'd like Verizon to respond to those arguments.
Yes. So, first of all, Your Honor,
Delmarva. Yeah, Verizon has.
I understood that. I haven't done telecom work in 20 years, so I wouldn't understand what they're talking about. First of all, Your Honor, we are not selecting a favorable item to modify the settlement. We're trying to explain an error that occurred when the settlement was formulated, and we are trying to demonstrate the fact that the starting point for the settlement for all parties, the staff, the Office of People's Counsel, and Delmarva Power, from a revenue requirement standpoint, was the 223.5 that Mr. Zeminski discussed. Secondly, rate-making adjustment 19 that was made in the rate case that was uncontested, we are demonstrating to the Commission that that's how Delmarva Power arrived at the $223.5 million for the revenue requirement starting point for the settlement negotiations. We are not seeking to go behind the curtain, as Ms. Ryan suggests, to look at how the Office of People's Counsel arrived at that 223.5 starting point. The point we're making is that was the starting point. And I find it a little bit surprising that Ms. Ryan would argue that the Office of People's Counsel was not including RMA 19 in that starting point in any event, because RMA 19 did not increase Delmarva Power's revenue requirement. It decreased Delmarva Power's revenue requirement. So what we are here today to try to do is enforce the settlement that we had between Delmarva Power, the staff, and the Office of People's Counsel.
I believe People's Counsel, though, is saying with respect to paragraph 2, you agreed to a rate base increase of $13.4 million.
And that number is not changing, Your Honor. We are still only seeking a $13.4 million revenue increase. What we're saying is the starting point, and Mr. Zeminski can speak to this probably more eloquently than I can, the starting point for that $13.4 million should have been the $22.35 million, not the $210.3 million that Delmarva Power used for designing rates.
So, Mr. Michael, I'm struggling a little bit with the way this is being characterized by the entities. Is this a rate design issue, or is it a mathematical error? And that, to me, is a question that I have, because in terms of what I hear and what I'll ask OPC, later, is does OPC agree that the $13.4 million increase is not being collected? And just sort of as a matter of fact, it is not being collected. But is this really an error because you didn't take into account the rates that were already approved and not really a rate design question. That's, one of my initial questions.
So let me try to answer that, and then if I get it wrong, Mr. Zeminski or Mr. Janoka will weigh in. We started the settlement with a revenue requirement number of 223.5. Unfortunately, and that's how we came to the 13.4 million, I believe. But for purpose of rate design, when we designed the rates, we only used the 210 million. And that's where the error occurred.
Yeah, that's sort of reemphasize that. Again, I go back to attachment B in the July 26th. I would categorize this as a rate design error. The sales revenues in which the whole revenue requirement was developed, worked upon in terms of settlement negotiations, uncontested, as Mr. McKeel said in regard to the annualization of the prior test case revenue increase that happened in the middle of the test period. Everything along those lines corresponded to a sales revenue that would be used for rate design purposes that would be 223.5 million, later reduced to 222.5 during the context of discovery. That's the pot of dollars that, in terms of sales revenue, that were factored into the revenue requirement. In terms of the pot of dollars that was factored into rate design, that's where the 210 million comes in. So at the end of the day, using those rates, what it would generate is $210 million worth of revenue, not the 223 that was factored into the revenue requirement during the course of the case that all the parties sort of worked towards. So you would just naturally have a shortfall based on the current rates that are in place. You won't get to 223. At most, you'll get to 210. So that's what the error is. The error was on the rate design side, not having all of the inputs necessary to align the revenues with what was in the revenue requirement.
Okay, thank you.
And based on those incorrect numbers, it appears that People's Counsel, to their detriment, relied on those incorrect numbers in agreeing to the settlement. Ms. Ryan makes the argument that there's the sanctity of contracts here. They bargained and assumed on one set of numbers, and here Delmarva now wants to change the numbers.
So my response to that is we determined the revenue requirement number, the 223.5 number first.
Which is not in the settlement.
It is not in the settlement agreement specifically, but it is in the case, it is in the record before your honors. And then you go about designing the rates. And so it is our position that all parties had agreed to the 223.5 as the starting point, and then the error occurred in the rate design portion.
Let me stop you there and ask both our staff and People's Counsel. Do you agree at the time of settlement that the revenue requirement was known to be 223.5 million?
I would say that the settlement didn't specifically state a total revenue requirement. It stated the 13.4 million increase.
I understand that. However, did our staff counsel, were they able to calculate that the revenue requirement was 223.5?
You can calculate it now from what's in the record, but what was in the record at the time the settlement was discussed. Now, I was not actually in the room doing that. Mr. Smith was, but it never found its way into the settlement, and I don't think we relied on that number.
And Ms. Ryan?
Well, I have two responses to that, one factual and one legal. From a factual perspective, I'm going to say I don't know. I wasn't here at the time that this settlement was negotiated. From a legal perspective, I would suggest that that goes into looking behind the parties' intents that were part of this negotiation process, which is privileged information.
Thank you. Commissioner O'Donnell.
Mr. McKeel, how do you assert that the record in 9455, the original case, the original testimony, established the 223 number that everybody should agree is the starting point?
We have, if you look at attachment B we have citations to the record that set forth all of those numbers that were in the record. The A, B, C, and D number that were in the record. We have all of the parties' testimony that are in the record. For example, the staff's testimony and the Office of People's testimony not contesting RMA 19, which is the root of the problem here. We also have, I think, documents that indicate that that was the starting point of the negotiations.
What documents?
Well, again, it's schedules that are not in the record, but in terms of how this settlement negotiations started, the company's initial position offered to the parties was based on its rebuttal revenue requirement position, its final litigated position. And embedded in that would have been the uncontested adjustment, RMA 19, again, at $13.9 million reduction to our revenue requirement. So that having that in as a starting point, again, was lowering our revenue requirement by 13.9. To sort of say that that's not in there, again, we settled for 13.4. If the revenue annualization adjustment was not in there, then we would have settled for something probably north of 19 if that wasn't sort of in the starting point number. So again, we settled for 13.4, the starting point for all the parties, and accepted by parties at least, was that we would start with the rebuttal position and then work on contested items off of that in terms of the negotiations.
Well, Mr. Zeminski, I don't want to go behind the curtain, and I don't think we should go behind the curtain, and I don't want to know what, if it's not in the record and it was part of your initiating your discussions for settlement, that's not something, in my view, that the commission should be looking at or even talking about, because settlement discussions, if we're going to have them, should be confidential, and I appreciate that, some of these numbers may be in these items here in the record, but with respect to who thought what, in settlement discussions, that I don't think that we should be getting into that in my view. So, I'd like to ask People's Counsel and staff on a different matter. Staff seems to agree that the company's not recovering the $13.4 million. Does OPC agree with that?
That appears to be the case based on the recent information provided by Delmarva. OPC would contend that whether or not they are actually earning that additional $13.4 million is irrelevant to whether or not...
Yeah, I understand. I just wanted to understand your position. Then, if I'm looking at the settlement, it says that the company filed rate schedules authorizing an increase of $13.4 million, a draft copy of the sheets implementing this increase. The fact is those sheets don't implement the increase. Isn't that right?
Those tariffs represented Delmarva's methodology for implementing rates that would achieve the agreed upon settlement, and were in fact incorporated and included as part of the settlement.
Right, I understand that, but the fact is they don't do that. A mistake was made, an error was made, and they don't implement the increase, right? I mean, I don't think we have disagreement on that. Do we?
Based on what Delmarva is currently saying, assuming their current calculations are correct.
Okay, thank you.
Two things. One, I just wanted to be a little bit clearer in my answer to the chairman's question earlier. I have checked with Mr. Smith, and the number $222.5 million was nowhere ever before us in the discussions in the record or in anything that we relied on. That was one. And I just do want to reiterate that based on the information we have now, we're talking about an additional $3.30 per month on a bill impact on a residential bill, and that's a little more than double of what the increase that was testified to at the time of the settlement hearings.
Does Delmarva agree with that rate impact of $3.30 per customer?
I do not believe so, Your Honor. We have in our first filing, let me just make sure I've got our number right. If you look at our July 26, 2018 filing, there would be a net reduction of $1.27
What
per
page
month.
are you looking at?
I'm looking at page 4, the first paragraph there, Your Honor.
Therefore, the net impact of the two filings is a net reduction of $1.27 per month?
Yes, Your Honor. That's including the reduction that we did for the TCJA.
Are we comparing apples to apples here? I'm hearing a reduction of $1.27 and an increase of $3.30.
To be clear, that is after all is said and done, and that includes the subsequent TCJA filing and the rate change that was made as a result of that. The $1.27 is probably approximately correct. I haven't verified that number, but the $3.30 is the approximate impact of adding this additional sum.
The net impact on a residential customer's bill would be $3.30. Yes.
Of this additional 12.14 million. And
Commissioner, Chairman, now the excuse me, customers are basically seeing a $4.58 decrease in their bills versus the $1.22. So that's where the 336 comes in. It is the impact of the adjustment that we're referring to, and that's on page 3 of our July 26th filing.
So, just to be clear, there's a lot of numbers flying around in this paragraph. Is $1.22 meant to be $1.27 or $1.22?
It's $1.22.
And I misspoke, Commissioner. On page 4, it does say $1.22.
Right, but then right above it, it says the net impact of these two filings is a net reduction of $1.27. 3 lines up.
It's $2.71 minus $3.93, so it's $1.22.
So the $1.27 is a typo?
Yes.
It's a Scrivener's error, and that's on me.
Okay. Just want to...
I'd like to just talk about the overall, the policy benefits of a settlement. And there are, a lot of savings that go to ratepayers and, to the commission and to the process. Are we, the staff seems to agree they've identified what the issue is. It was a rate design error, something that is very clear. It was based on the underlying information. Maybe it wasn't specifically, the rate requirement, revenue requirement wasn't explicit, but it was part of all the information that was available to staff and to OPC and parties at the settlement. Is that correct?
if you did all the math at the time, then you could arrive at that number.
Okay, and everyone seems to agree that yes, an error was made in the rate design efforts. So, I guess the question I have about this is, if we go ahead and suspend or deny what is being requested as far as this to make the correction, that means we're going to have to go possibly pretty quickly back to a rate case or some very extended procedure. Given that it seems that everyone agrees with the underlying numbers and what the issue is this something that can be worked out again so that we continue to benefit from this settlement?
One solution that could happen that nobody has really raised here is that the change could be made by agreement to the parties. The one way to reopen the settlement is for the parties to agree to a change, and all of them to unanimously request it. I hadn't said that before because I didn't see us getting there. But in essence, if you are reopening the settlement on that basis, then at that point the parties have the right to renegotiate essentially the whole package, and might very well want to, because at this point they're being asked to give something away. The legal rates that have been in effect since February that are approved are the rates that came from the settlement modified by the Tax Cut and Jobs Act filing. So, and, certainly when I said earlier, how do you balance the equities and how do you interpret the settlement, neither of those is an easy answer or an easy question, because on the one hand, the settlement has a revenue requirement that specifies that number, and Delmarva is seeking to rely on that. On the other hand, the settlement also had rates, which were very clearly stated in the settlement and which were testified to by the witnesses who provided testimony in support of the settlement. And OPC is entitled to rely on those rates as a matter of the settlement. So it's so really at that point you have two equally competing ways of interpreting the settlement, and it's not clear to us which one should prevail, if either should. Which is why I said earlier that the cleanest way to do this is through a rate case, and failing that, at the very least, you would probably want some kind of hearing that lets you put the information in an evidentiary record that would support your decision.
Okay. Well, just again, going back to the this overall agreement that there are great benefits from a settlement, and it appears that everyone understands what went wrong here. Is it possible, if maybe not 45 days, but the company suggests that maybe we delay it 17 days, that the parties could I guess explore whether such a settlement, renegotiation of the settlement, or just a agreement that yes, there was a legitimate error made here and that it could be corrected. Would that be something that could be accomplished in a shorter 17-day period of time, to at least kind of explore that option? Because it sounds like at this point that has not been discussed at all.
That has not been discussed. Given the schedules that we have on staff, I would say that the shortest time we could willingly agree to would be probably 3 weeks or 30 days, either of those. But beyond that, certainly we would be willing to discuss it a little further. I can't speak, obviously, for OPC on that.
And again, since we don't know what goes on in a settlement, I guess that the question in my mind is, had this information been, had it not been incorrect, that you all went into it knowing the $233 million revenue requirement, would that have changed anything? Would you have still, may have arrived at the same, agreement on the $13.4 million increase, and then the rate design would have been correct? It's a question I have, and it would be interesting to know if the parties could, again, salvage this settlement so we don't have to, again, go to a full-blown rate case, which I don't believe would be in the best interest of the parties. So, and also, am I correct that at this point, a concession the company is making is to not retroactively apply the increase?
You are correct on that,
Okay,
Commissioner.
so there would be that benefit. So anyway, any other comments about this, maybe a shorter period of time to see if the parties could resolve this and come back to us with a solution?
I can state pretty clearly that OPC would not reach that agreement. While we do agree that it appears that they made a mistake and that the information that they have filed suggests that the way they're doing their calculations does fix their mistake. Again, it is their mistake. We did rely on those tariffs that were filed with the settlement. Settlement testimony on all parties was based on those tariffs, not merely on the text in the settlement. The rate increase that was testified to by Delmarva's witnesses was based on those tariffs. That is an explicit part of the settlement agreement. If the information that Delmarva has currently provided is to be used as a basis to change the rates. That information is in contradiction to the current record in this case. The evidentiary record was established at hearing when testimony and exhibits were admitted. The testimony and exhibits in this rate case testify to a specific number for the rate increase for residential customers, and that is the record. The record was closed when this became a final order approving the settlement.
We recognize
Okay,
that,
so just
Ms. Ryan.
so clearly then,
OPC
doesn't see there would be benefits to the ratepayers to try to salvage this settlement.
At a minimum, there would need to be,
go to a full-blown rate case.
at a minimum, there needs to be a new hearing, at least on this issue. Because if a settlement implementing this modification is approved, it will be in direct contradiction to the record in this case, and it will not be supported by substantial evidence.
Ms. Ryan, I believe Commissioner Richard is trying to find a more efficient way outside of a rate case, or we accept Delmarva's revised tariff sheets outright. I personally do not see a bar to doing so legally or otherwise. And I think in this case, we all recognize that a mistake, an honest mistake was made. I still haven't heard from Delmarva why that mistake was made, and maybe that's not important. Obviously, we don't want to have a situation where parties would take advantage unduly of that mistake, but we're probing whether or not another black box settlement could be effectuated in this matter. And I understand that OPC is not interested. Is that what I'm hearing?
If the settlement is renegotiated, OPC will renegotiate the entire settlement, not merely this term.
Your Honor, can I just respond to a couple things,
Yes.
arguments by OPC? First of all, as pointed out by Commissioner Herman, the tariff sheets that were attached that our folks testified to were true and correct weren't, as a matter of fact. You heard Mr. Spivak say, and I think Mr. Janoka will tell you, if you go through and you do the arithmetic related to those tariff sheets, they do not provide the company, OPC, or staff the benefit of the $13.4 million rate increase that we all agreed to. And nowhere did I hear Ms. Ryan suggest that the Office of People's Counsel did not agree to a $13.4 million rate increase. Unfortunately, and the mistake is on us, and we own up to it, and we're forgoing $7 million of revenue that we believe we should have gotten, but there has to be some consequences for us making the mistake. So all of the evidence is in the record. All we're asking to do is put the correct tariffs in place that represent that settlement.
If I might add two things. The rates that were in the rate sheets, they did implement a $13.4 million revenue increase. It was just that the starting point of that revenue increase was incorrect. That's one. And the second thing is, because staff is often very focused on bill impacts, and that follows the commission, if we had seen a $6 plus bill impact as the result of the settlement, we might have arrived at a different revenue increase that we would accept. We probably would not have accepted that same figure.
Let me ask you this, Mr. Spivak. My understanding is that any black box settlement, which are frustrating to me, can be regressed back through if you know certain things are true. In other words, it's a simple mathematical process to go back. If you know that your starting point is the uncontested record in the case, and you know what the agreed upon endpoint is, you can go back mathematically. If you can't tell what the contested points actually were in the mix, were in the soup, but the uncontested points you can tell were in the soup and agreed upon by everybody. Is that not so?
Not necessarily, Commissioner, because in the context of settlement discussions, everything is up for grabs. So even items that are uncontested.
So I would have to make
modified.
the assumption that the record was changed on, not the record wasn't changed, but the settlement changed people's previous positions that were in the record
That is quite possible,
on uncontested items.
even on uncontested items.
If I might add something, the filing of pre-filed testimony does not necessarily preclude the parties from contesting issues at a later date. The fact that they were uncontested in the pre-filed testimony did not mean that any of the parties waived an opportunity to contest them through cross-examination or during the briefing process.
Fair enough. Thank you. I appreciate it. I wonder if OPC would have the same position if there was if the error was going against the ratepayers in
We
the
would.
settlement. We would?
We would. We believe in the finality of the order approving the settlement that is primary.
Thank you.
Commissioner Herman. Commissioner Linton. Yes.
Sorry. I'm curious if, for staff at OPC, we've referenced, or at least the company has referenced a lot, the attachment B in their July 26th filing. They've got 3 columns here to describe the difference in the revenue requirement. And I'm curious for OPC and staff, are you supportive of these numbers? Do you think these are accurate? Is this reflection of information? Is there some problem with it, or is it accurate?
David Hoppock on behalf of staff. Good afternoon, Mr. Chairman and Commissioners. So specifically looking at the corrected revenue for rate design, the furthest most column to the right, we would agree with the 12.9 annualization adjustment. We have gone through the math and basically agree that that method is consistent with how annualization adjustments were done in previous Delmarva rate cases that were then approved by the Commission. And then, the rest of it just flows from there.
OPC is not prepared to agree to the accuracy of any of the information submitted by Delmarva relating to this modification. As you know, Commissioners, OPC does not have in-house technical staff to run calculations for us. Doing enough examination and enough investigation to determine what extent we think their numbers are accurate would require an additional expenditure of monies that we are trying to avoid.
Your Honor, I would just say that we offered on numerous occasions to offer up our subject matter experts to speak with the OPC subject matter efforts, Dr. Pavlovic and Mr. Efron in that case, and have a meeting, and, but we were told no.
And I will say that for the most part, Delmarva has been cooperative. Mr. Pavlovic did send some data requests. It has been a very short time frame for us to work with, especially considering that Mr. Pavlovic's access to the discovery documents was unavailable for a time last week. But again, we run a fine line when it comes to spending money, that we can have him do a quick analysis, but in order to determine to what extent the information filed, provided by Delmarva is accurate, and we might agree with the accuracy of the numbers, that would take a larger contract than we currently have and would require expenditure of additional money that we would like to avoid spending if we don't have to.
Okay, so I guess the challenge I'm running into is really the first 2 paragraphs of the settlement, and I know one of my colleagues mentioned this already. But we're looking at draft tariff sheets, and I'm wondering why the company's proposal now is not just a errata filing. Why is it seen as something that's not reflective of the data that's been presented here, either here today or their ability to collect the full revenue requirement that was agreed to in the settlement? Is there something that I'm not catching on to here? Because clearly we're not interested in going back and trying to undo the black box settlement. I mean, it's not something we have the option to do. There's not going to be evidence in the rate case to show why each party agreed to the numbers that are there. So what am I missing here?
I'm not sure you're missing anything. The settlement, the draft tariffs filed with the settlement contained certain numbers. The numbers that they're filing now contradict those numbers. It's that simple.
Okay.
But isn't it just as simple that they're not recovering the $13.4 million?
It appears that way, but that has not been concluded. That is not an actual part of the evidentiary record in this hearing.
So, was OPC aware at the time of the settlement was finalized that the tariffs didn't yield $13.4 million?
No, Delmarva drafted the tariffs, and OPC relied on Delmarva's calculations.
Okay. So, Mr. Michael, I had one question about your July 26 filing. You said you're only seeking to correct the error as of the date of this filing, which would be the 26th. If the commission were to suspend the tariffs for 17 days, would you still not be seeking to recover between, sorry, I don't know when the 17th day was, but...
We would not seek to recover that stub period. We would seek to recover
going forward.
Moving forward. I mean, the way the tariffs attached are written are for effective on usage on and after August 25th, 2018. I think we'd be willing to change that date if the commission so directed us to do so within a reasonable time frame.
Okay, thank you. And Ms. Ryan, if the commission were to suspend for the 17 days with the allowing staff and OPC potentially to make sure that these numbers were correct, because it seems like staff has some questions about, the numbers, would OPC participate in that review?
I think that we would need more direction from the commission as to what was going to happen at the end of the 17 days. As I've stated, the evidentiary record in this case is closed. If there's going to be a modification to the settlement, the evidentiary record needs to be reopened, and OPC would want the opportunity to cross-examine and test the witnesses and the facts in this case.
Well, I think the commission may not agree that this is a modification to the settlement, but we can talk, we can discuss that later. But Mr. Spivak, your filing seems to indicate that there's information out there that you're just not sure of or you don't have. Are there any specifics that you can provide the commission with respect to what it is that's missing or what it is that you want to do within this 45-day period you've requested?
Well, from a legal perspective, I want to be on a little bit firmer ground because this is an unusual legal circumstance. So I have a little more research to do on that and just a little more compilation to do. Mr. Hopper can tell you what we believe is needed in terms of numbers.
In terms of the rate design side, we want to do additional analysis and ask the company for what the bill impact analysis would have been had this error not occurred. As Mr. Spivak spoke to earlier, when we were reviewing the settlement, we were looking at the bill impact analysis as presented by the company and through our own analysis. With this additional $12.14 million, that changes that bill impact analysis. So we want to be able to look at what that would have been in case 9455 had there been the additional 12.14, and then I've done it, but just for the residential for the current rates with this additional increase. So bill impact analysis, and then thinking through, given that new bill impact analysis, would that have changed how we approach the settlement process?
And you think you'll be able to say, I would have settled at this number, but not at that number? Is that what you're suggesting you need time to do?
I don't know that we would be able to resolve that, but we would certainly have information at what the bill impact would have been had this error not have occurred. So,
And also, that would be what the bill impact would be going forward on the classes other than residential.
Right, I'm just having a little bit of a hard time understanding what you're going to do with that. I get that you can get that information. I'm having a little bit of a hard time understanding what you would do with that information, but thank you.
Just to be clear, does either Staff Council or People's Council have any outstanding data requests that have not been responded to by Delmarva?
I do not believe so.
No, Your Honor.
Mr. Chairman.
At this point, why don't we take according to this clock, a 10-minute break and reconvene? I don't imagine we'll go much longer, and then we could adjourn for the day. So 10 minutes according to this clock. At 12:55, we will reconvene. Okay, we are back on the record. We've heard a lot of compelling arguments today. A lot of numbers have been thrown around, both by People's Council, Delmarva, and our staff council here. I think the numbers that we've reviewed on Attachment B are important. I think we're all in agreement that a mistake was made by Delmarva in calculating its numbers. And the fact that the settlement does permit them to recover $13.4 million in revenue requirement, a rate increase of $13.4 million that they are currently unable to collect based on incorrect numbers that they put into their rate design. At this point, since Delmarva has offered, I would propose that the Commission suspend the tariff sheets for a period of 17 days, and we'll take this up at a future administrative meeting on September the 5th. During that time, I would ask both Staff Council and the People's Council to review those numbers and bring back any arguments with respect to how those numbers would impact the rate increase as contained in the settlement and advocated by Delmarva. But that is just solely my opinion. I would ask my commissioners to share their own perspectives.
I'm not going to add any more to that. I think you've stated it correctly. I think 17 days would be helpful, and again, giving the parties a chance to talk and to clarify where they stand on those numbers. So I support your proposal.
Commissioner O'Donnell.
Yeah, I'd like to support the proposal, Mr. Chairman, and I think particular attention needs to be paid to all of the numbers on Attachment B, so that we can get to the accuracy or the veracity of those numbers.
Commissioner Linton.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would also support the proposal, and in the spirit of the agreement that occurred as a part of the original settlement, I would hope that the parties would be able to share information in an expeditious manner so that when we return in September, we're able to resolve this at that time.
Commissioner Herman.
I concur. I just want to be clear that the Commission would like for staff and the People's Council to discern whether the rates that are currently being collected are not collecting the $13.4 million, and also review the tariff pages that have been filed by the company and confirm that those numbers would in fact collect the $13.4 million if the Commission were to adopt them. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Madam Secretary, if we could place this item at the end of the agenda for the September 5th, 2018 administrative meeting.
We will do so, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. This meeting is adjourned.
Your Honor, if I might, one quick question.
Okay. Miss Ryan, the meeting is...
This is a very easy one. Will transcripts of today's hearing be made available?
I will let the Executive Secretary respond to that.
We can discuss that after the
Thank you.
meeting. Thank you.
One moment.
And we did suspend the tariffs, is that correct, for 17 days? Was that a clear motion?
Yes.
Okay, was great, thanks.
Thank you. This meeting is now adjourned.